My dear students, I am pleased to welcome you to this presentation on audit of the disaster recovery and the business resumption plan. This is part 5 of the presentation on chapter 4, which covers business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning. This is part of the final ISCA paper, Information Systems Audit and Control. If you have not gone through the earlier presentations, I suggest you please look at the presentations 1 to 4 and also look at the introductory presentation on the ISCA paper. Let's look at the learning objectives of this chapter. We know that we want to understand what are the concepts of business continuity management. We want to understand what are the key phases and the components of preparing a business continuity plan. We also understand what are the key aspects of business continuity plan, specifically in terms of the implementation. We discussed in the earlier part where we talked about different types of backups, the different types of plans which should be there, and also the procedures which need to be followed for disaster recovery planning. And in this part of the presentation, we are going to discuss how to audit a business continuity plan. Now, remember in this presentation, we talked about BCM, we have talked about BCP, and we have talked about DRP. I wanted to emphasize once again, I don't want you to confuse about this terminology. DRP deals with technology, business continuity deals with the business process, and we look at business continuity in terms of the continuity at the enterprise level. Now, a lot of procedural aspects which are given are repetitive in nature. Depending on the context of the question, you should be able to pick up. Now, what are the aspects you're going to cover in this presentation? One, how do you audit a disaster recovery or a business resumption plan? And next, we'll also have an overview or a summary of what is covered in this chapter. How do you audit a business continuity plan or a business resumption plan or a disaster recovery plan? The most important thing, the first starting point is to actually set the objective. Based on the objective, you also need to define the scope. What is going to be the deliverables? For example, in the case of disaster recovery plan, the fundamental area of focus is the information system processing, which means you will be looking at the technology infrastructure. The organization is supposed to have a business continuity plan in place, so you look at how to audit this, which means primarily when you look at audit, you look at two factors. You need to review and evaluate. The management is supposed to have implemented the business continuity plan. You go back and review what they've done, which means you revisit and confirm whether the business continuity plan is working as envisaged. You also need to ensure, as a business continuity auditor, to verify the residual risks which are available in the organization, which exist in the organization after the business continuity plan, whether they continue to exist and whether these are knowingly accepted by the management. What is availability? Business continuity plan is fundamentally about the availability of the resources. So availability definition is that the probability that system is operational at any time and as and when required, and also you look at the percentage of uptime. Now let's have a quick overview of what is BCP all about. We know BCP is fundamentally a process which involves planning in advance, and this planning is for various types of disaster scenarios or the potential events which can disrupt a business, which can impact a business. So you identify the various types of disasters which can happen. Based on that, you do an impact analysis, which is also called a business impact analysis. And then based on the business impact analysis and the needs of the business, you decide the recovery strategies. And you prepare the business continuity plan. And this business continuity plan is a living document, is not a document which is prepared once for all, which means you need to constantly and continually test, maintain, and update the plan as per the requirements. Now, in this context, let's understand what is the role of the audit. The role of the auditor is to review, depending on the objectives and scope which has been set, to review the specific aspects of the business continuity plan, verify and validate whether the business continuity plan is working as envisaged. Now, with this background, let's go in detail and look at what are the detailed steps to be followed for implementing or auditing the business continuity plan. BCP, when you're auditing, you're looking at fundamentally whether it's auditable. So when you have a BCP in place, if it is not auditable, which means it's not really implementable. When it's auditable, which means you can actually measure it against established criteria or a benchmark. Now, where do you get this established criteria or benchmark? Now, this could be formulated based on the policies, procedures, and practice of the organization. This could also be based on the best practices which are applicable for the organization. For example, for BCP, you have various types of frameworks which are available. Even COVID can be used as a framework for the purpose of implementing the best practices for BCP. So you need to adopt the best practice from different frameworks and use them as required. One of the first important things an auditor will verify is how the risk assessment has been done or the threat analysis been done while preparing the business continuity plan. We have told you that when you're preparing the business impact plan, the most important aspect is the business impact analysis. So what is the business impact analysis or risk analysis? You see here, a process where all the possible threats to the system are identified. You also have a list of the threats which could be applicable to the organization. And you look at the severity of the threats in terms of what is the impact of the threats and how they created and how they impact the organization. You also decide, depending on the threats, what are the relevant controls which actually exist in the organization, and these controls will actually mitigate this risk. You need to prepare and document these threats and the controls. And this list which is prepared, which is the list of the threats, the vulnerabilities, the relevant controls which are there, and this will be used for defining the residual risks which are existing in the organization and also prepare the backup plans as applicable for the organization. Now let's look at a very simple model for a risk. If you look at risk, we are looking at the assets which are used in the organization. You look at the different types of vulnerability, you look at the different type of threats. The interface between the threats, the vulnerabilities, and the assets gives rise to risks. And when you're doing a risk assessment, what is most important is to identify the critical assets, vulnerabilities in the system, the threat environment, and you need to identify the critical assets which are impacted because based on the known vulnerabilities, and you will look at the impact on account of the threats actualizing in terms of the exposure. These critical assets, which are the known vulnerabilities which are applicable to the organization, need to be reviewed and evaluated. And for this, you need to have the right level of controls. The most important aspect, if you remember, when you're doing a risk assessment or a threat analysis, to actually decide what are the residual risks, and this residual risk should be accepted knowingly. So when you're preparing a business continuity plan, you're looking at what are the different type of threats, vulnerabilities, and the resulting risks, and whether those risks are acceptable. So business continuity plan is all about disasters which can happen. So you need to envisage the different types of disaster scenarios, how they're going to disrupt the operations, and you should be able to continue the business operations despite a disaster. Now let's look at what are the objectives of a BCP audit. When you're doing a BCP audit, you're auditing what is the organization done, what the enterprise has done for implementing the BCP. You evaluate the process which have been followed within the organization. This process should be documented. This should be communicated to all the related employees. You also need to have plans for testing and maintaining this. So fundamentally, BCP is about assessing the ability of the enterprise to continue all critical operations during a contingency, during an emergency, during a disaster, and to be able to recover from a disaster within a defined critical recovery time period. You'll find this has been emphasized so many times. When you look at BCP, now these are the critical things. You have critical, critical, critical. What's critical? You identify the critical business process, you identify the critical recovery time, and you also define the critical resources which are required. And you also have the minimal downtime which you need to have. Based on this, you should be able to identify the residual risks, which means these are risks which are not identified, and these should be knowingly accepted. If these are not knowingly accepted, when you do the audit, you should be able to provide recommendations to mitigate this risk. IS audit, any type of an IS audit, is fundamentally about identifying whether risks are mitigated by implementing the right level of controls, and if these are not adequate, which means the risk is greater than the controls, you need to identify the control weakness. The control weaknesses will result in an exposure, which is a potential loss. I'm sure this has been repeated so many times. This should become internalized as far as you're concerned. The same concept of this IS audit is applicable for a BCP audit. It is also applicable for a SD also audit or any type of audit. Now you prepare the plan of action for each type of expected contingency and check whether it actually meets the requirements. How do you audit a BCP? Let's look at quickly the steps which could be followed. You need to understand the responsibility for preparing the business continuity plan is of the organization. You need to understand and evaluate the business continuity strategy which has been adopted at a macro level. The board of directors or the senior management has to be involved in deciding what is the business continuity strategy. Now, this strategy would vary depending on the type of the operation, depending on the nature of business operations. For example, if you look at an online real-time store, the business continuity is very critical because even a 1 hour downtime will cause reputation and loss of customers. You need to evaluate the plan for accuracy and adequacy of what has been documented. Verify the plan is effective. Effectiveness would mean that it provides the result as required or as envisaged. You evaluate the offsite storage. These are some of the critical aspects. You evaluate the ability of the IS and the user personnel to respond effectively to any type of disaster as and when it happens. And you ensure that the maintenance of the plan is done. And you also ensure the readability of the business continuity plan manuals and the procedures. It should be easy to read and simple to understand and implement. So if you look here, primarily we are looking at there should be a framework for business continuity planning, and this should be properly communicated. All the key areas should be documented, and this should be tested, and this should be maintained. When you're reviewing a BCP, what are the aspects you will check? You will check what the management is supposed to have done, have they actually done, and whether it's providing the results. So you look at the basic elements of a well-developed plan and check whether the documents are current and up to date, because the BCP, which is outdated, is useless. You look at the effectiveness of the document, whether documents actually communicate and reflect the reality, the existing scenario of the enterprise. You interview the personnel to check whether they know what is to be done. You know that they know the responsibility in the case of a disaster. You also review the BCP test results, whether testing has been done, what the impact of the testing, and whether based on the results of the testing, corrective action has been taken. You evaluate the thoroughness and accuracy of the business continuity plan, whether it reflects the correct situation, and whether it's been up to date, and whether it corresponds to the responsibilities which have been applied. You also determine the problem trends. So it means you look at different type of incidents and how the management has actually responded, especially the specific people who have been assigned the responsibility, how they responded, the timeline, and also the results of this. You also would evaluate the offsite storage, which means to look at the synchronization of the data, the currency of the media, and the documentation. You also perform a detailed inventory review to check what are the inventory requirements and whether this actually reflect the inventory which is supposed to be there within the organization. You review all the related documentation, check whether the documentation is correct, complete, and is up to date, and also been shared, and the employees know how to use, which means you also have the appropriate training pertaining to the documents. So you evaluate the availability of the offsite in terms of the facility, in terms of the, first you look at the availability, you also look at the adequacy and also the appropriateness of the offsite facility. You also interview the key personnel to check whether they understand the responsibilities, and also the documentation, the current latest documentation as applicable to the enterprise has been kept in an offsite location. So you also evaluate the security at an offsite location, evaluate the physical and the environmental access controls. You check the equipment to check whether it's actually working, whether there are calibration tags for this. You review the alternate processing contracts with the vendors and the service providers against specific requirements and guidelines as per the requirements of the business continuity or the disaster recovery plan based on the strategy as set by the management. So you look at the contract and check whether the contract is clear and understandable and communicates the deliverables and the timelines and the milestones, both for the existing and the emergency situations. You also look at the compliance requirements and the contractual requirements and check whether this actually take care of contingency also, which means in the case of emergency, the vendor who's supposed to provide the service is able to provide the service as required. You look at the insurance cover and see whether the insurance covers all the assets. Not only that, it also covers the cost of the recovery, and check the adequacy of this in terms of does it cover the media damage, does it cover the business interruption, does it cover the equipment replacement, does it cover the business continuity processing, and it is comprehensive to take care of all the damages which can happen. So if you remember the risk management strategy we talked about, so this is the aspect, insurance is the aspect of sharing or transferring of the risk. So when you're sharing or transferring the risk, as per the risk management strategy, you have to ensure that this risk management has been done exactly to meet the needs of the management, and all the requirements of the enterprise in terms of transferring risk or sharing the risk with the insurance agencies are met by ensuring the completeness and the comprehensiveness of the insurance cover as required for the business. Now let's look at quickly some of the sample business audit steps. Now they are quite extensive, elaborate. Now in the examination, it may not be possible that you need to reproduce each and everything. Now in the context of the question of the examination, you need to decide what is relevant and provide this. I want you to remember one important principle when you're doing the audit. The management is supposed to implement the BCP. As an auditor, you're reviewing and evaluating whether these have been implemented as per the needs of the organization. So the same context, if you look at in terms of BCP, there are various steps the management has to follow. Let's say if you're doing audit of a BCP from the perspective of the components which are there for BCP, or you're looking at BCP audit from the point of the key phases, or you're doing the audit from the point of advocacy or completeness of the BCP, depending on the scope and objective of the BCP, you'll have the relevant audit steps. Now here we are giving a simple sample audit steps covering most of the areas. For example, let's start from the beginning. You look at the disaster recovery business resolution plan to check whether the plan actually exists, or this just documents, pieces of documentation which are there, and whether they followed a structured methodology adopting the best practices are required. What are the elements of this? So in a case of business plan, you need to identify and prioritize the activities which are essential to continue the key business operations. The plan also has to cover the most important aspect, which is the business impact analysis. And this business impact analysis has to cover all the essential or critical functions. The operations managers and the key personnel who need to be involved in development of the plan have been actually involved and contributed to the ideas, so that the business continuity plan actually is realistic and can be practically relevant for the organization. You look at the plan to identify the resource requirements and check whether resource requirements have actually been correctly and completely identified, and they're enough to meet the availability requirements of a disaster. The plan should be simple and easily understood by the employees. You also look at the training requirements. So the most important aspect is when you're preparing a business plan, you make a lot of assumptions. You need to check whether these assumptions are actually valid. Now let's look at some of the more sample BCP audit steps. You determine if the information pertaining to the backup procedures are they sufficient to allow for recovery of the critical data. Then you also look at whether the test plan, because you know that in BCP testing is very important. You check whether the test has been properly done as per a proper plan, and what are the different types of scenarios which have been envisaged, and whether these scenarios have been tested. What is the result of the test, and what is the action which has been taken based on the testing. You determine the resource requirements for the BCP for various types of disruptions and check whether these resource requirements have been kept current by having the right resources. You also review the disaster recovery in the business assumption plan and check whether actually is current and relevant and reliable. You may also look at the plans for disaster recovery and business assumption testing and look at the documentation pertaining to the actual test and see who are the people involved, whether all the people were involved, and what are the type of scenarios were tested, and whether these actually scenarios reflect the realities pertaining to the business, and based on that decide whether the testing is adequate for the purpose of needing the needs of the business. You review the business impact analysis. This is the most important aspect in business continuity planning. So the management has to start by doing business continuity planning by actually doing a business impact analysis. The auditor has to look at the business impact analysis primarily from the perspective of checking whether the business impact analysis has been done correctly to reflect the actual scenarios, the different types of scenarios, whether these scenarios are comprehensive enough to cover all the critical risks which impact the organization. You also gather the background information as to the criteria which has been used, the guidelines which have been used for preparing the business continuity plan, and whether this actually are relevant to the business and whether they meet the needs of the business. You determine whether the copies of the plan which are supposed to be safeguarded and kept in offsite storage have been actually kept in offsite storage. You gain understanding of the methodology which has been used by the organization for preparing the business continuity plan, and check who participated in the development of the business continuity plan and whether they have been adequately trained and they have covered all the critical business processes. You gain understanding of the methodology used for the purpose of developing the business impact analysis and look at the details to see whether it actually reflects the different practical scenarios which are applicable to the organization, and also considering all the critical contractual and legal requirements. You also look at the recommendations made by the external auditors who actually done this, if this external agency have been involved in doing a business impact analysis, whether these have been properly implemented. Which means if a BCP audit has been done and there have been a business impact analysis which has been reviewed, you check at the finding and check whether all the recommendations have been actually implemented. You look at the resources, whether resources have been properly allocated as required for the organization, and whether these resources which are kept for the purpose of backup or the business resumption plan are actually updated or kept current, and these are not outdated and ineffective. You'll also determine if the plan has been dated each time so that it's updated as required. You also determine if the plan has been updated within the past 12 months. Quite often, you remember, we talked about continuous maintenance or regular maintenance. You could have a regular maintenance, you could also have an ad hoc maintenance depending on the criticality of the changes which have happened. Now let's look at some of the sample audit steps. You determine all the locations where the disaster could happen, where the disaster recovery plan is to be stored, and are there multiple locations which have been envisaged, and whether these are accessible and easily available to the employees as and when needed. You also look at the backup procedures which have to be followed in the enterprise and the time which is required for recovery, and does it envisage the business scenario, which means there is a critical recovery period which has been identified for each type of critical business processes, and whether this actually is the one which is relevant for the business. You interview the functional area of managers or the key employees who have been assigned the responsibility to check, do they have a clear understanding of what are the role they need to perform? If the training has not been done, if the employee don't know the role, in that case, you know that this will not be, the business continuity plan will not be effective, because in the case of disaster, these employees will not be able to effectively discharge their duties as required. You also need to look at the provision of the personnel as required. You also look at the key employees, whether they've seen the plan, whether they've been trained, they've also been told about specific roles and responsibility, and if there are contractual requirements, these have been put into effect. You also look at the business resumption plan, whether it has all the contact details of all the people who are required. It includes the employees or the vendor, and also the availability contact details after the working hours. The disaster recovery plan also has to consider the needs of people with special requirements. You also need to consider the replacement staff who may be required in the case of emergency. Now let's look at some of the aspects pertaining to building, utilities, and transportation. We'll have aspects that, okay, in case of building, there should be a building engineer who should be able to inspect the building and look at the facilities and be able to assess the damage. You also have the alternative shelter, the alternate offsite which has to be there. You also review the agreement which has been entered into for the backup facilities. So verify whether the backup facilities are adequate. You also look at the utilities which are required for the organization to run the business process, or the critical business process in the case of a disaster, and check the electrical power, natural gas, toxic chemicals, etc. All the resources which are required, whether these have been properly planned, and also look at the impact. You also need to look at the safety features pertaining to the building, whether these have been infected and whether these have been updated. You also need to look at the transportation in the case of emergency. Now, this transportation could be for the purpose of evacuating the people from the area of work or the area of disaster, or it could also be pertaining to transportation arrangements which are required to bring the employees to a new area of work or to the offsite location. Now, let's look at some of the aspects pertaining to information technology. This is a very critical aspect. You need to look at whether the business continuity plan reflects the current. Now, we are getting to the most important aspect, the critical application systems. Whether the organization has envisaged what are the critical business processes, what are the technology requirements for that, in terms of the operating system, the database, application software, etc. We also need to look at the recovery capabilities of each of the critical systems and how this has been envisaged and planned, and whether this has been tested and whether it meets the requirement. You also look at the arrangements for emergency telecommunications or network services. You also need to look at what are the alternate mechanisms for transmission of the data in the case of an emergency, in the case of a disaster. You look at the testing schedule, whether testing has been done and whether it's appropriate. Now let's look at the administrative procedures. Now administrative procedures focus on the administrative and the management aspects, and these are related to the operational area. So there is a management plan. Now if you remember earlier we discussed about the disaster recovery procedural aspects. So this has to be comprehensive and cover all the areas. Now these administrative aspects could be pertaining to access to the building or the place of work. Now you could also be looking at the offsite location and see whether this is available as and when required. You also look at the designated emergency operations center which is available, where the incident management system team can work as required. You also look at the procedures for the disaster, right from the time the disaster is happened, the declaration of the disaster, the general shutdown where you declare an emergency, migration of the employees or the migration operations to the backup facility, and also to restore the operations. You also need to ensure there are duplicate set of essential records with the documentation which are available in a secure location. You also need to ensure that you are able to retrieve the documents as required in the case of emergency. For example, you have to make an insurance claim. You need to ensure a copy of the insurance claim with the forms, the relevant forms, is actually available in the offsite location, because the original document will be lost in the fire. Does the disaster recovery plan include the names and contact details of the suppliers of essential equipment or the key service provider? This is another aspect you will cover. You may also look at what are the provisions of the utilities which are required to run the operations, and also whether the management has provided the required authority to the employees to be able to spend in the case of emergency. You also need to look at the executive management who is supposed to handle the disaster to mitigate the risk, and what are the role and involvement in the development of the plan, whether they agreed with the selection strategy pertaining to critical business processes, because fundamentally they are the ones who have to approve. You also need to look at the criticality of the essential activities and the priorities for recovery. All these have to be approved by the management. Let's have a quick recap of what we have discussed in part 5 of the presentation, where we talked about what are the different steps, procedures which are to be followed for doing a BCP audit. We know that BCP has to address the business requirements. So as an auditor, when you're doing the audit, fundamentally you need to understand what the process is all about. You remember when you talked about information technology audit or information systems audit, it's all about technology. And technology is used for processing the data with the information systems, and this information systems process the information which is required for the enterprise. When you're coming and doing the audit, you're looking at what the management is supposed to have done, review the technology in terms of risk, security, and control, review the information systems, and also look at the information to check whether the information meets the enterprise requirements. In the case of a BCP, we are fundamentally looking at what will happen on account of failure of IT and what is the impact on the critical business processes. So you need to ensure the critical business processes have been identified, and these are verified and validated internally through a testing and an update. And as far as the audit is concerned, you're looking at walking through what the management has done to validate externally whether it actually meets the requirements. What are the advantages of having a business continuity process? We know that you're able to recover from a disaster in a minimal agreed time to ensure the minimal impact on the business. So you also need to know that there are adequate resources which need to be provisioned to meet the needs of the business. The management has to be involved actively at different layers, at different levels, to identify the critical business process, to verify and validate how this business continuity planning is going to be done. So business continuity planning is a planning exercise. The senior management has to formulate the strategy and the policy based on which the implementation management, including the functional heads and the IT department, have to be involved at different levels as required in ensuring that the business continuity plan which has been prepared actually meets the needs of the business, reflects the reality of the business. So when you look at business continuity planning, you look at proactively planning the availability of the resources to run the business process, the critical business process as required. Now let's look at the learning objectives. So this is what we discussed as far as the chapter is concerned. We understood business continuity management as a concept. We understood the different phases and components of business continuity plan. We also looked at the key aspects of business continuity plan, especially from the perspective of implementation. We also talked about in chapter 4, part 4, about what is backup, what are the different types of backups, what are the different types of plans, what are the different types of alternate procedures, and the detailed list of the procedural aspects we have to follow for disaster recovery planning. And we also looked at how do you audit a business continuity plan. And this part of the presentation, part 5, was primarily about how to audit a business continuity plan. As I said, there are multiple steps which are given. You may find that it might be difficult to remember each and every step. But please remember, you know what is business continuity planning, you know what is disaster recovery planning, and you know what management has to do. The best way to remember is get into the shoes of the people who are supposed to perform the task. To remember this, you have to look at it from an inside-out perspective, not an outsider-in perspective. To understand, you need to get inside and look at, if you're an employee of the organization, what would be your responsibility? And then it's very easy to implement. Now let's look at the task statement we had for this particular chapter. To design, develop, implement, test, maintain, and audit all key phases. We already covered this in detail. We also looked at how risk assessment could be done, and this primarily from the point of business impact analysis. Now, this is what you should be able to do when you read this chapter. So business continuity planning, the content which is given is not necessarily from a theoretical perspective, is also given from a practical perspective. And let's look at the knowledge statement. To be able to perform the task, you should know what are the concepts, what are the components of business continuity management. You also need to know how a business continuity plan is developed, what are the disaster recovery plans, how these are developed, what are the different components of plans, including the emergency plan, and this how you can do the audit. You also need to know what are the different phases and the components of a business continuity plan, because only when you know the components, you can actually do an effective audit. What are the topics we have covered? In part 1 of the presentation, this is what we have covered. The primary focus was on giving an introduction to what BCP is all about. In part 2 of the presentation, we looked at components of BCM process, we looked at the BCM management process, and we also looked at the BCM information collection process. Part 3 went into details of the strategy process pertaining to BCM. We looked at the development and the implementation process, the testing and maintenance, and the training program which need to be conducted. Part 4, we looked at primarily the different types of plans, and we understood how backups could be taken, what are the impact of the backups, different types of backups. We also looked at the different alternate processing facilities, such as the hot site, warm site, cold site, and also the reciprocal agreement. And we went to the detailed procedural aspects pertaining to the documentation covering various aspects of the disaster recovery procedure plan. And part 5, we looked at audit of the disaster recovery or the business recovery plan. And here we are providing the summary of what is covered in the business continuity plan. Now let's complete an overview of what this chapter is all about. We have business continuity plan, and for business continuity plan, you need to do business continuity planning. You need to implement the business continuity plan as required, and you need to ensure there are backups and disaster recovery procedures which are formulated. You also need to know how to audit. Audit covers all these areas. So you look at the business continuity management in terms of the policy, strategy, aspect, in terms of the budgets, in terms of who approves. You look at the business continuity planning to identify what are the critical business processes which are there, what are the resource requirements which are there, and also look at whether the personnel which are required for this have been allocated. You look at the backup procedures also when you're doing the audit to check whether this actually meets the requirement of the enterprise. So fundamentally, audit is all about reviewing and evaluating whether the management has actually implemented the business continuity plan as per the needs of the organization, and whether it is result oriented, which means it is effective and also efficient. The scope and objectives of the business continuity plan would be defined by the management, or as a part of an internal audit, you may be also asked to look at the business continuity plan. With this, I hope you have been able to get a good overview of what the business continuity plan about. Now let me give you a quick summary. The total number of pages in the business continuity plan is only about 28 pages. and whereas generally you have anywhere between 8 to 12 marks. And you find out of this 20 pages, there's a lot of repetition. So probably you have to understand only about 80 to 20 pages. And most of the procedures which are given, you can call it as common sense. Now, what is important is how do you make the common sense as common? And that is by internalizing and understanding the subject. So if you read this for the purpose of remembering and mugging, this is going to be very difficult. But if you internalize, adopt, and from the perspective of application, you find it very easy to understand. This is not a topic which you need to read multiple times. So understanding ISCA could actually be a big time saver because you're not going to really spend a lot of time. And this could help you in scoring very good marks. But what is most important is that you need to look at the right perspective. You need to adopt the right perspective. You need to understand the principles. You need to understand the philosophy, what ISCA is all about. In this presentation on chapter 1 and chapter 4, based on my experience, I've shared with you what are the principal philosophies and the key concepts of how ISCA is going to be studied. It has to be studied to see that you use it not only from an exam perspective, but also from a real life perspective. So the best way to score good marks in the exam is to actually look at it from the point of a real life situations and adopt it. Then you internalize and becomes very easy to understand. I hope you have learned through these presentations. I suggest that you make this as the beginning of your learning, and based on the need, go back to the study material, read and revise again. You find probably you read 2-3 times, within a few hours you will be able to get mastery over this subject. And this is a subject which is quite easy, which is also practical to implement. Thank you very much. I enjoyed making this presentation. I hope to see you again in the near future, in future learning sessions. Thank you very much and wish you all the best.